September 1945. Okinawa. The air still carried the smell of burned earth and sea salt. Weeks earlier, the island had been one of the bloodiest battlefields of the Pacific War. Now the guns were silent, replaced by the slow movement of people emerging from caves, shelters, and shattered villages. Among them were Japanese women attached to military units, nurses, clerks, labor auxiliaries, exhausted by hunger and uncertainty. They walked cautiously toward an American processing camp assembled from canvas tents and supply trucks. Many expected interrogation. Some expected punishment. Nearly all had been warned for years that capture by American forces meant humiliation or worse. Metal trays clattered near a field kitchen. Steam rose from large pots of rice and soup prepared by U.S. Army cooks working methodically under orders. Armed American soldiers stood nearby, watching the line form. Then something unexpected happened. As the women hesitated, unsure of protocol, the soldiers quietly stepped aside. No shouting, no commands, just a gesture, allowing the prisoners to approach the food first. Confusion spread faster than relief, because this moment had begun long before Okinawa, shaped by years of war, belief, and preparation that neither side fully understood yet. The moment on Okinawa, in September 1945, was not born from kindness alone. It was the final consequence of a war that had consumed nations, reshaped societies, and drawn civilians, especially women, directly into military systems on an unprecedented scale. When the Pacific War began in December 1941, Imperial Japan mobilized with extraordinary speed. Early victories across Southeast Asia and the Pacific created the image of unstoppable expansion. Military culture emphasized endurance, sacrifice, and absolute loyalty to the emperor. Capture was considered dishonorable. Surrender, in many cases, was treated as unthinkable. As the war intensified after 1942, Japan faced a growing logistical crisis. Industrial shortages and mounting casualties forced the government to expand women's participation in wartime roles. Thousands joined auxiliary organizations connected to the Army and Navy. They served as nurses, communications clerks, factory workers, translators, and logistical assistants. Many were young, recruited from schools or civilian workplaces under national mobilization programs. By 1944, American strategy in the Pacific had shifted decisively. The United States advanced through an island-hopping campaign designed to bypass strongholds while cutting supply lines. Battles at Saipan, Leyte Gulf, and Iwo Jima demonstrated the increasing imbalance of industrial power. American production delivered ships, aircraft, food supplies, and medical equipment at scales Japan could no longer match. The Battle of Okinawa, beginning in April 1945, became the war's most devastating preview of invasion. Over nearly 3 months, American forces fought entrenched Japanese defenders across rugged terrain, while civilians remained trapped between armies. Japanese military doctrine discouraged surrender, and many civilians have been warned through propaganda that Americans would commit atrocities if they captured the island. This belief shaped expectations long before surrender occurred. Wartime media in Japan portrayed Allied soldiers as brutal occupiers. Stories emphasized revenge for Pearl Harbor and depicted captivity as a fate worse than death. Such narratives were not unique to Japan. Propaganda existed on all sides of the conflict. But within Imperial Japan's rigid military culture, these messages carried particular psychological weight. As American forces advanced, Japanese command structures began collapsing. Supply chains failed. Communication lines broke down. Units fragmented. Many auxiliary personnel, including women attached to hospitals or administrative centers, were left without clear orders. Some continued caring for wounded soldiers in underground facilities. Others fled with civilian groups seeking shelter from bombardment. By June 1945, organized resistance on Okinawa effectively ended, though scattered fighting continued. Tens of thousands of survivors emerged from hiding, physically weakened and uncertain of their fate. Among them were women who had spent months under bombardment, surviving on limited food while witnessing the destruction of entire communities. The announcement of Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, transformed the situation overnight. Emperor Hirohito's recorded broadcast reached populations exhausted by war but unsure what surrender actually meant. For many Japanese civilians and auxiliaries, the concept of laying down arms before a foreign army had no cultural precedent. American forces suddenly faced a logistical challenge unlike any earlier stage of the war. Victory did not simply mean defeating enemy armies. It meant managing millions of displaced individuals across the Pacific. Prisoners, civilians, wounded soldiers, and support personnel all required processing, feeding, medical screening, and transportation. Within this massive transition, Japanese women captives occupied a unique position. They were neither conventional combatants nor ordinary civilians. Many had worn uniforms or worked inside military systems. Yet they arrived at Allied camps carrying deep fear shaped by years of wartime messaging. They approached American lines, expecting interrogation or punishment. Hunger sharpened anxiety. Discipline kept them silent. Every movement by Allied soldiers was watched carefully for signs confirming what they believed captivity would bring. But the American soldiers preparing those camps were operating under instructions formed long before the surrender. Policies rooted not in improvisation, but in doctrine developed across decades of modern warfare. And understanding those policies requires looking beyond the battlefield itself into how the United States prepared to manage victory even before the war was won. Long before Japanese prisoners approached American camps in 1945, the United States military had already begun planning for the responsibilities that followed victory. Modern war, American planners understood, did not end when fighting stopped. It ended only when defeated populations could be stabilized, fed, and governed without chaos. The foundation for this preparation lay in the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war, an international agreement defining minimum standards for captivity. The United States formally adopted these rules and integrated them into military training manuals during the interwar years. Officers were instructed that prisoners were not targets of punishment, but individuals under military custody, entitled to food, shelter, and medical care equivalent to that given to one's own troops whenever possible. By the early stages of World War II, the U.S. Army had created specialized administrative systems for handling prisoners. Camps constructed across the United States already held large numbers of German and Italian POWs captured in North Africa and Europe. These facilities became testing grounds for procedures involving ration distribution, sanitation, medical screening, and labor regulations under international law. The Pacific Theater presented different challenges. Geography, climate, and the intensity of combat meant that large-scale prisoner handling had initially been rare. Japanese soldiers often fought to the death, and surrender occurred less frequently than in Europe. As a result, when American planners began anticipating Japan's eventual collapse in 1944 and early 1945, they prepared for a sudden and unprecedented influx of prisoners and civilians. Imperial Japan's military culture rested on hierarchy, ritual, and visible expressions of authority. Rank structured daily life. Obedience flowed downward. Public displays reinforced discipline. Even in collapse, many auxiliaries retained instinctive habits, standing rigidly, avoiding initiative, waiting for commands before moving. American military culture operated differently. Rank mattered, but interaction between enlisted personnel and officers was less ceremonial. Informality existed within discipline. Orders were delivered directly, often without theatrical display. Soldiers were trained to follow procedure, not to dramatize it. When Japanese captives approached American camps, these cultural differences became immediately visible. Guards did not shout unless necessary. Movements were controlled, but not exaggerated. The absence of overt hostility did not eliminate authority. It altered its presentation. For prisoners conditioned to expect dominance expressed through intimidation, The quieter posture of American soldiers felt disorienting. Authority that did not rely on humiliation suggested a system confident in its position. That confidence, more than any individual gesture, unsettled assumptions formed during years of total war. Food distribution highlighted this contrast. In Japanese military environments during the war's final months, scarcity often forced strict ration control. Senior personnel typically received priority. Lower-ranking auxiliaries waited. The act of American soldiers stepping aside momentarily inverted expectations without abandoning control. It conveyed order without degradation. Such cultural collisions reshaped perception. Captives began observing details beyond immediate survival: organization, cleanliness, predictability. These impressions influenced how the occupying force would be remembered long after repatriation. Humane treatment was not solely moral policy, it was also strategic calculation. American planners understood that Japan's surrender would not instantly dissolve loyalty structures or wartime beliefs. Occupation required stability, not resentment. Psychological warfare units had long studied the impact of controlled compassion. During earlier campaigns in Europe and North Africa, consistent prisoner treatment reduced resistance and fostered cooperation. In the Pacific, where surrender had been rare, demonstrating adherence to international norms carried additional significance. Allowing prisoners orderly access to food and medical care undermined propaganda that portrayed Americans as vindictive. It also reduced the risk of unrest within camps. Stability conserved manpower. Soldiers guarding cooperative prisoners required fewer forceful interventions. Reports from occupation authorities in late 1945 emphasized the importance of maintaining dignity during intake procedures. Humane practices signaled that the conflict had been directed at military aggression rather than civilian existence. This distinction supported broader Allied goals of reconstruction and political reform in Japan. Strategic humanity did not eliminate surveillance or discipline. Guards remained armed. Registration procedures were thorough. Interrogations occurred where necessary. Yet these actions unfolded within a framework designed to prevent unnecessary humiliation. The power of this approach lay in contrast. By behaving predictably and lawfully, American forces weakened narratives that had sustained resistance. Small gestures, including stepping aside during food distribution, reinforced the image of an occupying force confident enough to show restraint. Over time, such gestures accumulated into a broader psychological shift, one that would influence how former captives interpreted the end of the war. Years after 1945, memoirs and oral histories began documenting these encounters. Accounts from Japanese civilians and auxiliaries frequently mention surprise at the conduct of American forces. While experiences varied by location and circumstance, recurring themes included orderly feeding, medical attention, and unexpected politeness. American military records corroborate procedural discipline within occupation camps. After-action reports detailed ration quantities, sanitation inspections, and medical statistics. The language remained technical, yet behind those numbers stood individuals navigating the aftermath of surrender. Historians analyzing occupation policies have noted that first impressions shaped long-term attitudes toward Allied authority. Early demonstrations of predictable treatment reduced panic and facilitated broader administrative reforms implemented during the occupation of Japan. The memory of being allowed to eat first may appear minor within the vast scale of World War II. Yet memory often attaches itself to moments that disrupt expectation. For women emerging from hunger and uncertainty, that disruption signaled the end of one reality and the beginning of another. Over time, these recollections entered public discourse, contributing to post-war narratives emphasizing reconstruction over revenge. They did not erase the devastation of Okinawa or the broader suffering of the war. They coexisted alongside those memories, complicating simplistic portrayals of victor and vanquished. By late summer 1945, the Pacific War had reached its formal conclusion. Emperor Hirohito's broadcast confirmed surrender. Allied forces prepared to transition from combat to occupation. Within that transition lay the decisive period when policies, logistics, and human emotion converged most intensely. The war had ended on paper, but on the ground, its final transformation was only beginning. Logistics officers developed standardized intake procedures. Newly arrived captives would first undergo disarmament and medical inspection. Malnutrition, dehydration, infections, and untreated wounds were expected conditions. Feeding protocols prioritized stabilization rather than interrogation. Military manuals emphasized that starving individuals could not be processed safely or reliably until physical recovery began. Food preparation units were instructed to serve meals that were simple but digestible. Sudden overeating after prolonged starvation could cause illness or death, so rations were often introduced gradually. Field kitchens became essential tools of occupation policy, not merely for nutrition, but for restoring order among populations emerging from chaos. Equally important was the role of American women serving within the military system. The U.S. Army Nurse Corps and the Women's Army Corps, WAC, expanded dramatically during the war. By 1945, thousands of American women were stationed across the Pacific, managing hospitals, administrative centers, and humanitarian operations. Their presence influenced the atmosphere of many processing facilities, particularly when dealing with female prisoners or civilians. Medical personnel received explicit instructions regarding dignity and professionalism. Cultural sensitivity training, though limited by modern standards, encouraged avoidance of unnecessary humiliation. Translators and interpreters were assigned whenever possible to reduce fear and misunderstanding during intake procedures. At the same time, humane treatment served strategic purposes. American psychological warfare planners believed that disciplined compassion could undermine enemy propaganda more effectively than intimidation. Demonstrating predictable, lawful behavior reinforced Allied claims that the war had been fought against militarism rather than against entire populations. Reports from earlier campaigns supported this approach. Prisoners who experienced consistent treatment were more cooperative, less likely to resist authority, and more willing to assist in reconstruction efforts after hostilities ended. Stability reduced the risk of unrest, disease outbreaks, and logistical breakdowns, all critical concerns in densely populated occupied territories. Thus, when Japanese women arrived at camps in Okinawa and elsewhere after surrender, American soldiers were not improvising acts of kindness. They were executing procedures shaped by international law, military planning, and strategic calculation. The soldiers standing beside field kitchens had received clear instructions: maintain order, avoid unnecessary aggression, and ensure prisoners were fed efficiently. Discipline governed behavior as strictly as any combat operation. Yet policies written in manuals could not predict how powerful small gestures might become when seen through the eyes of individuals whose expectations had been formed by years of fear. In that gap between doctrine and perception, ordinary actions acquired extraordinary meaning, and the reactions of the captives revealed dimensions of the war rarely visible on the battlefield. Those reactions can best be understood by examining the event from multiple angles: human, cultural, strategic, and psychological, each revealing a different layer of what truly happened in moments like the one at the food line. For many Japanese women arriving at American-controlled camps in late 1945, captivity represented the collapse of an entire worldview. Years of wartime education and media messaging had constructed a clear expectation: the enemy would be harsh, humiliating, and dangerous. Capture meant loss of honor and personal safety. Instead, the first encounters were often quiet and procedural. American soldiers spoke through interpreters or gestures. Weapons remained present but lowered. Orders were delivered calmly rather than shouted. The absence of immediate punishment created confusion more than relief. Psychologically, expectations shaped perception. When reality contradicted those expectations, individuals struggled to interpret what they were seeing. Historical occupation reports noted that many prisoners initially avoided eye contact and hesitated before accepting food. Some waited for hidden conditions or sudden changes in behavior. The discipline of American troops, standing in formation, allowing orderly movement, avoiding unnecessary physical contact, appeared unfamiliar to individuals conditioned to expect dominance expressed through visible authority. This reaction was not unique to Japanese captives. Across multiple theaters of World War II, defeated populations often experienced a similar moment of cognitive dissonance when encountering structured but restrained treatment. The shock came not from generosity alone, but from predictability. Procedures replaced fear. In that environment, even small gestures carried symbolic weight. When soldiers stepped aside during food distribution, it reversed assumed hierarchies. The prisoners remained under guard, yet the immediate interaction suggested control without humiliation. For individuals emerging from months of deprivation, this contradiction became emotionally overwhelming. The war had taught them to expect cruelty. Discipline instead became the first sign that the war they understood was already ending. Behind every moment at a field kitchen stood an immense logistical system. The United States military approached feeding operations with industrial precision. By 1945, American supply networks delivered millions of rations daily across oceans, stretching thousands of miles. Food distribution in POW processing areas followed strict planning. Kitchens operated on schedules designed to prevent crowding and panic. Soldiers assigned to food service received instructions emphasizing efficiency and calm behavior. Maintaining order was essential. Hungry crowds could quickly become unstable. Meals were intentionally simple: rice, canned meat, vegetables, soup, and bread when available. Medical officers supervised portions to avoid refeeding shock among malnourished individuals. Water purification units ensured safe drinking supplies, a critical difference from conditions many captives had endured during the final months of war. Allowing prisoners to eat first was not merely symbolic courtesy. It often served practical purposes. Stabilized prisoners reduced security risks, required less medical intervention later, and could be processed more efficiently through registration and relocation systems. American soldiers themselves operated within rationing structures and strict schedules. Stepping aside temporarily did not represent surrender of authority. It demonstrated confidence in logistical abundance. The United States possessed sufficient resources to maintain both control and generosity simultaneously. In this sense, compassion emerged from organization. Industrial capacity translated into humane outcomes. The ability to feed former enemies revealed the scale of American wartime production more clearly than any battlefield victory. To observers shaped by scarcity, the abundance itself appeared almost incomprehensible. The presence of women within military environments added another layer of complexity to these encounters. Japanese female auxiliaries had served within hierarchical structures emphasizing obedience and endurance. Many had worked long hours under difficult conditions, particularly during the final year of the war when shortages intensified. American women serving overseas occupied a different institutional role. Members of the Army Nurse Corps and Women's Army Corps functioned within professionalized systems emphasizing medical ethics, administration, and standardized care. Their authority derived from training and specialization rather than rigid social hierarchy. When Japanese women encountered American servicewomen, the interaction challenged assumptions about gender roles in wartime. American nurses moved confidently through camps, issuing instructions, organizing treatment areas, and interacting directly with soldiers and officers. Their visibility suggested a military culture operating under different social expectations. Medical treatment further reinforced this contrast. Bandaging wounds, distributing hygiene supplies, and conducting health examinations required physical proximity conducted with professionalism rather than intimidation. For prisoners anticipating hostility, These interactions introduced unfamiliar forms of authority based on expertise rather than coercion. Shared gender experiences sometimes softened communication barriers. Interpreters recorded instances where basic gestures, offering water, adjusting blankets, guiding injured individuals, reduced tension faster than formal orders could achieve. These moments did not erase the reality of defeat, but they altered how captivity was experienced day by day. Through these encounters, the war briefly revealed two competing models of mobilization, one driven by total sacrifice under scarcity, the other sustained by industrial resources and institutional structure. And while these human and logistical dynamics shaped first impressions, deeper forces were also at work. Cultural expectations, strategic intentions, and long-term psychological consequences that extended far beyond a single meal line. August 15, 1945. At noon in Tokyo, Emperor Hirohito's voice reached the Japanese population through radio broadcast for the first time in history. The recording was formal, indirect, and difficult for many listeners to understand immediately. Yet its meaning became clear within hours. Japan had accepted surrender. The war that had defined an entire generation was over. Across the Pacific, American commanders received confirmation through military channels already preparing for this outcome. Combat operations slowed, but uncertainty replaced battle. Millions of Japanese soldiers, auxiliaries, and civilians remained scattered across islands and territories devastated by years of fighting. On Okinawa, where organized resistance had largely ceased weeks earlier, surrender transformed the landscape almost overnight. Caves that once served as defensive positions became shelters for civilians waiting cautiously to emerge. White cloths appeared cautiously at entrances. Groups approached American lines slowly, often carrying wounded companions or improvised belongings gathered during months of survival underground. American units transitioned rapidly from combat posture to occupation procedure. Engineers cleared roads. Medical teams expanded field stations. Supply officers redirected shipments from ammunition toward food, water purification equipment, and medical supplies. The objective was no longer defeating an enemy force, but stabilizing a population exhausted by war. Processing areas were established near secure zones. Canvas tents rose beside supply depots. Registration tables were assembled from wooden crates. Translators, often Japanese Americans serving in the military intelligence service, became essential intermediaries, explaining instructions and reducing fear among new arrivals. The first days revealed the scale of humanitarian crisis. Many captives suffered from malnutrition after months of limited rations. Diseases linked to poor sanitation spread quickly among displaced groups. Medical officers prioritized triage, separating those requiring immediate treatment from individuals capable of waiting in processing lines. Food distribution became one of the most critical operations. Kitchens operated continuously, converting military rations into meals suitable for weakened civilians and auxiliaries. Army cooks adapted menus when possible, preparing rice alongside standard provisions to ease digestion and encourage acceptance. Despite surrender, tension remained high. American soldiers had fought fiercely on Okinawa only weeks earlier, sustaining heavy casualties. Many guards had lost comrades during the campaign. Commanders emphasized discipline repeatedly, reminding troops that the mission had changed. The enemy army had ceased resistance. Those approaching camps were now prisoners under protection of military law. For Japanese captives, uncertainty dominated every step forward. The concept of surrender conflicted with years of instruction, emphasizing endurance to death. Some approached cautiously, unsure whether acceptance of food or medical aid would carry consequences. Others remained silent, observing carefully before acting. It was within this fragile psychological environment that routine procedures acquired unusual intensity. Every gesture by guards was scrutinized. Tone of voice, posture, distance, small details shaped perception. At one processing site, Long lines formed near a field kitchen as newly arrived groups waited for their first organized meal since the surrender announcement. Steam rose into humid air. Metal ladles struck cooking pots rhythmically. American soldiers maintained spacing between groups to prevent confusion. The prisoners hesitated at the edge of the serving area. Years of hierarchy conditioned them to wait for explicit command. Some expected soldiers to eat first, reinforcing authority before allowing captives access. Others braced for interrogation to precede any relief. Instead, instructions focused on order and safety. Interpreters signaled where to stand. Medical staff observed quietly, watching for signs of collapse among those weakened by hunger. Then, following established intake protocol prioritizing stabilization, guards stepped aside to allow the prisoners forward. The action was efficient, practical, almost routine to the soldiers performing it. Yet to those witnessing it, the meaning felt far larger. The absence of hostility created a pause, a brief suspension between expectation and reality. Hunger urged movement, but disbelief slowed it. Some prisoners glanced at one another before approaching, uncertain whether the gesture concealed a test or misunderstanding. American personnel continued working without ceremony. Meals were placed on trays. Water containers were refilled. Names were recorded for later processing. The machinery of occupation functioned steadily, indifferent to the emotional weight carried by the moment. For the first time since surrender, many captives experienced an interaction defined not by fear, but by structure. Authority remained unmistakable, yet it expressed itself through organization rather than intimidation. This quiet shift marked more than a feeding procedure. It represented the instant when surrender moved from abstract announcement to lived reality, when former enemies began confronting a future no longer governed by wartime expectation. And as the lines advanced and food was finally received, the psychological turning point deepened, revealing consequences neither side fully anticipated when the war officially ended. By late afternoon, the initial lines at the Okinawa processing camp had dispersed, but the significance of the day was only beginning to unfold. Japanese women captives, many of whom had lived under strict military hierarchies for years, now faced a simple reality. They were alive, fed, and unmolested. It was a paradox so profound that it took time to register fully. For some, the act of being allowed to eat first carried layers of meaning. It contradicted decades of indoctrination in imperial education and wartime propaganda. Soldiers who had been described as cruel, vengeful, or unpredictable now operated under rules that were structured, fair, and surprisingly patient. The recognition of order without intimidation created an emotional opening. Hunger persisted, but fear began to wane. Medical staff moved among the captives, checking for signs of dehydration or malnutrition. Bandages were replaced, wounds cleaned, and simple hygiene instructions offered. For the women, these gestures were deeply humanizing. They had anticipated punishment, yet received care. Their bodies responded to nourishment and attention. Their minds began adjusting to a reality in which survival no longer required constant vigilance. Interactions with American women further reinforced the dissonance. Nurses and WAC personnel supervised treatment, guided movement, and occasionally offered translation support. Captives observed that these figures, authoritative yet approachable, were exercising control in ways that emphasized safety, not fear. The contrast to their experience under Japanese military authority was stark and disorienting. Across the camp, small acts began to accumulate meaning. Soldiers held doors open. Water was offered before long marches to processing stations. Clothing, blankets, and hygiene supplies were distributed efficiently. Every procedure adhered to established protocols, yet from the perspective of the captives, it felt unprecedented. These actions were gestures of structure, but they were interpreted as gestures of consideration. For women who had endured hunger, bombardment, and fear, the psychological impact was immediate and profound. The turning point extended beyond individual comfort. Captives began internalizing a new understanding of their situation. Surrender did not entail humiliation or immediate reprisal. Discipline and order could coexist with respect for human dignity. Propaganda that had depicted Americans as vengeful became increasingly untenable. Each meal received, each wound treated, each orderly instruction followed, chipped away at fear, replacing it with comprehension. Observation of American logistics further strengthened this recognition. Tents were organized for efficiency, medical stations were clean, and supply chains ensured consistency. For captives conditioned to scarcity and unpredictability, these signs revealed the scale and reliability of Allied resources. Stability became visible in physical space as well as in behavior. Structure itself became an instrument of persuasion, subtly teaching that cooperation would be safer than resistance. By evening, trust, fragile and nascent, began to take root. Women who had hesitated to approach the field kitchen earlier now moved with greater confidence. Conversations, quiet and tentative, began to emerge through interpreters. Some shared observations of fellow captives, noting differences between what they had expected and what they were experiencing. Collective realization grew. Surrender was not merely a political declaration. It was a lived condition, one that demanded acknowledgement and adaptation. This psychological shift held consequences beyond the immediate moment. Captives who began to trust the authority of their guards were easier to register, house, and medically evaluate. Cooperation reduced friction and risk within the camp, allowing American personnel to maintain order while simultaneously implementing care and recovery programs. Strategy and humanity converged, transforming routine procedures into tools for stability and rehabilitation. The significance of the turning point extended into memory. Women later recalled this moment, being allowed to eat first, as emblematic of the broader occupation experience. It was a simple act with extraordinary emotional resonance, emblematic of how structured, law-abiding treatment could reshape the perception of an enemy's intentions. By the end of that first full day, the contours of a new reality were clear. Hunger persisted, fear lingered, but the foundation for trust, comprehension, and eventual cooperation had been established. The war had formally ended, yet its final battle, the battle of perception and psychological transformation, was unfolding quietly in lines, tents, and kitchens across Okinawa. The war was over on the battlefield. Yet in these camps, the outcome of surrender itself was still being negotiated, not through violence, but through order, discipline, and the subtle assertion of humane authority. The first meal had been served, and with it came the first signs that captives could survive not only physically, but psychologically, within the framework of a new, post-war reality. With the formal end of hostilities, the focus of the American military shifted from combat operations to the management of prisoners, displaced civilians, and recovering territories. The Okinawa processing camps became centers not just of custody, but of rehabilitation. Japanese women captives, previously exhausted by hunger, illness, and fear, were now receiving structured care designed to restore health and stability. Medical personnel prioritized the most urgent needs first. Malnutrition, dehydration, minor injuries, and untreated infections were addressed systematically. Nurses maintained detailed logs of each patient, monitoring recovery while providing treatment in a calm, professional manner. These interventions were critical. Even weeks of inadequate nutrition had left lasting physical vulnerability. Gradual refeeding programs ensured that no one fell ill due to sudden changes in diet. Nutrition and order went hand in hand. Meal schedules were precise, minimizing lines and crowding while maximizing efficiency. Prisoners were fed in groups, often allowed to approach food first to maintain calm and reduce stress. For many women, these small gestures of priority symbolized respect and acknowledgement of their humanity, reinforcing psychological recovery alongside physical nourishment. Beyond the medical and nutritional dimensions, the American administration focused on documentation and identification. Registration included personal details, previous military or civilian roles, and locations of capture. This process not only facilitated eventual repatriation, but also created a sense of structure and predictability, further alleviating anxiety among captives. Living arrangements were carefully managed. Tent assignments and sanitation protocols maintained hygiene and reduced the risk of disease outbreaks. Showers and laundering stations were established, providing prisoners with the first consistent access to cleanliness in months. These practical measures, though seemingly routine, were integral to rebuilding confidence and trust in a post-conflict environment. Importantly, American female personnel played a central role in these recovery operations. Their presence normalized interactions, offered guidance, and occasionally mediated between guards and prisoners. While authority remained firmly under military control, the visibility of women in positions of responsibility subtly reshaped expectations about leadership and behavior. Reports from this period highlight the immediate outcomes of these interventions. Within days, previously weak and wary captives regained strength sufficient for participation in registration, medical evaluations, and educational or vocational programs. Discipline in the camps reduced incidents of disorder, creating a safer environment for both prisoners and American personnel. The psychological impact extended beyond survival. Witnessing structured, law-abiding treatment challenged deeply ingrained narratives instilled by wartime propaganda. Captives began to see a clear distinction between victorious enemies and the abstractions of wartime fear. Human behavior, in its organized, compassionate form, became a tool for reshaping understanding and establishing trust. Simultaneously, American soldiers and officers observed the practical benefits of this approach. Calm, cooperative prisoners required less oversight and fewer resources for security interventions. The ability to combine authority with humane treatment validated pre-existing strategies and demonstrated the efficacy of predictable, professional conduct in occupation scenarios. Thus, in the immediate aftermath of surrender, camps like those on Okinawa functioned as microcosms of post-war reconstruction. The war's destruction remained evident in shattered buildings, empty fields, and the lingering trauma among civilians. But within these camps, order, nourishment, and care formed the foundation for recovery. Each meal, each bandaged hand, each structured activity signaled a shift from survival under duress to structured adaptation under humane authority. The experience of Japanese women captives during these early weeks exemplifies how careful, disciplined management of post-surrender populations could achieve multiple objectives simultaneously: restoration of health, stabilization of behavior, and subtle reinforcement of Allied moral authority. These outcomes would not only shape immediate survival, but also influence long-term memory and post-war reconciliation. The broader consequences, however, extended beyond the immediate weeks. Recovery in the camps set the stage for repatriation, educational programs, and long-term cultural interactions that would define the post-war relationship between Japan and the United States. As weeks turned into months, the initial stabilization of Japanese captives evolved into structured programs for repatriation and reintegration. Military administrators coordinated transportation to the Japanese home islands, often using naval vessels adapted to carry large numbers of civilians safely. Arrival procedures included medical inspections, verification of identity, and organization into groups to prevent disease outbreaks during transit. For the women, this was both an end and a beginning. Leaving the camps meant returning to a homeland devastated by war, yet it also marked the conclusion of immediate captivity. Beyond the physical journey, the psychological impact endured. Many Japanese women carried lasting impressions of the American approach to surrender and treatment. The memory of orderly food distribution, calm supervision, and attention to basic needs became a touchstone for post-war reflections. Oral histories and memoirs recorded decades later consistently note surprise, disbelief, and a profound sense of relief when confronted with actions that contradicted years of wartime indoctrination. These testimonies form part of the historical record that illustrates how humane treatment during surrender can influence perception and memory. The American strategy of disciplined compassion also had broader social implications. By adhering to Geneva Convention standards, the U.S. military established credibility not only with prisoners but with local populations observing occupation practices. This approach facilitated smoother transitions in governance, reduced resistance, and laid the groundwork for post-war reforms that would include education, healthcare, and civic participation. The emphasis on predictable, humane treatment became an instrument of soft power, demonstrating the contrast between Allied authority and the rigid militarism that had previously dominated Japan. Historians examining the occupation note that such small gestures, from allowing prisoners to eat first to the professional conduct of medical and administrative personnel, had ripple effects. They reinforced narratives of moral superiority, helped disarm cultural hostility, and contributed to the gradual rebuilding of trust between former adversaries. While the larger consequences of defeat included infrastructure devastation, social disruption, and political upheaval, these micro-level interactions provided essential stabilizing elements that made reconstruction possible. Repatriation and reintegration were not without challenges. Many women returned to communities where homes were destroyed, resources scarce, and family members lost. Social stigmas attached to captivity complicated reintegration. Yet the psychological buffer provided by humane treatment during American custody often mitigated immediate trauma, offering survivors a model of authority grounded in order and care rather than fear. This distinction became particularly important in educational programs and vocational training offered in the early post-war years, where trust in institutional frameworks was essential. On a cultural level, these interactions contributed to long-term shifts in perception. For Japanese society, encountering Americans who operated with discipline, respect, and compassion challenged monolithic wartime narratives. It provided evidence that surrender did not equate to degradation, and that recovery, education, and eventual cooperation were possible. These lessons shaped both individual attitudes and broader diplomatic approaches, influencing Japan's post-war reconstruction and eventual alliance with the United States in subsequent decades. Finally, the historical significance of these experiences extends to the methodology of military occupation itself. The Okinawa processing camps and similar sites across the Pacific demonstrate how structured, humane treatment of prisoners and civilians can achieve strategic objectives without resorting to coercion. Authority exercised through order and care proved more effective than force alone, both for immediate stability and for the cultivation of long-term positive outcomes. These lessons resonate in modern military doctrine and humanitarian strategy, underscoring the enduring importance of combining discipline with respect for human dignity. By the end of 1945, the first meals served in Okinawa, the calm supervision of medical personnel, and the orderly distribution of resources had done more than restore health. They had initiated the transformation of fear into comprehension, chaos into order, and mistrust into cautious acceptance. In these small yet pivotal moments, the human consequences of victory, surrender, and occupation became tangible, forming a bridge from war's devastation toward the possibility of reconciliation. The image of Japanese women captives stepping forward to receive their first organized meal under the watchful yet calm eyes of American soldiers endures as a quiet emblem of the Pacific War's final human dimension. It was a moment defined not by artillery or strategy, but by discipline, order, and the unexpected power of humane treatment. In that pause, between fear and comprehension, the psychological weight of war met the practical structure of occupation. Small acts, stepping aside to allow others to eat first, carefully tending to wounds, maintaining predictable routines, revealed that authority could assert itself without cruelty. For captives who had endured propaganda, deprivation, and the threat of violence, these gestures were transformative. They reshaped expectations, softened suspicion and created the first tentative bridge between former enemies. Humanity, carefully disciplined and thoughtfully applied, became a strategic instrument as potent as any weapon. The lessons of Okinawa extend beyond that island, beyond the immediate participants. They illuminate how wars experienced not only on battlefields but in lines at kitchens, tents, and medical stations. They remind us that victory is measured not only in territory or casualty counts, but in the preservation of human dignity and the establishment of trust. The careful integration of law, logistics, and compassion demonstrates that structured systems can reconcile order with care, discipline with humanity. Decades later, historians, memoirists, and scholars reflect on these moments as pivotal in shaping post-war memory and relations between nations. They illustrate that war's legacy is carried not only in destruction, but in small gestures that affirm life and provide hope. In the simple act of allowing captives to eat first, the U.S. Army demonstrated that the end of a conflict could also be the beginning of understanding, reconciliation, and a new chapter in human interaction. Okinawa, burned and scarred, became more than a battlefield. It became a lesson in the power of disciplined humanity, a reminder that even in the aftermath of immense violence, respect, order, and care can transform fear into comprehension, leaving a legacy that resonates far beyond the immediate moment.